Hello, my name's Paul Burke. I'm the Chief Executive of Northern Territory Farmers Association. Welcome to the Growing the Territory weekly webinar series. We're up to episode 4 now. So thanks a lot for joining us. We've got a pretty big crew on today. I'd like to introduce Louise Bilato, the CEO of Northern Territory Transporters Association and the Buffalo Industry Council. So thanks, Louise. Ashley Manicaros, the Chief Executive Officer of Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association. Thanks for joining us, Ashley. And Will Evans, CEO of Northern Territory Livestock Northern Territory Live Exporters Association. Now, if that's not a mouthful, I don't know what is. So the purpose of today is to have a little bit of a conversation with all of the peak industry bodies about a little bit about where we've come from and where we need to go to into the future. Some of the opportunities and also some of the challenges in front of us. Obviously, over the last 10 weeks, we as a group have met on numerous occasions in numerous forums, and we are trying as hard as we can as a group of industries to look after agriculture and to speak with common voices. So today is a little bit about just having a conversation. There is a Q&A button down the bottom. If you'd like to flick a question in, please do so. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And I've got some pre-worked up questions here that we've received from various sources over the last couple of days. So I might kick off with you, Louise, and feel free to talk about transporters and Buffalo, or Buffalo and transporters, whichever order or whichever is the most relevant. So what's been the biggest challenge facing your industry right now?
From a Buffalo perspective, the biggest one has been understanding whether the Section 19 land use agreements will be able to be utilised. A lot of the free-ranging buffalo are on Aboriginal owned land, and I know that there's been groups of musterers who have been putting their COVID-19 management plans in place, but if we're not able to access those lands using the Section 19s this dry season, then that's going to significantly impact on the buffalo supply chain going forward. Obviously, the export markets have been weakened with so much uncertainty internationally, and that's been a concern. People just trying to forward plan, and at the moment, because Ron Jungle doesn't have its Tier 2 accreditation and are just obviously stockpiling meat, with the price of the live weight for buffalo in the abattoir at the moment is very low. So that's also going to be a concern for the industry going forward if that price doesn't move up. From a road transport perspective, just very quickly, the most critical thing has been focusing on training and ensuring that no complacency creeps in, because the industry has been going very hard since the emergence of the COVID-19 crisis and have been crossing borders, and because all freight has been essential, have been working very hard. We need to ensure that the jurisdictions that are now going to be putting in their COVID-19 plans that haven't had them, as much as possible align with what ours already have, who have got them in place, doing, so we don't add additional administrative burdens on the road transport industry.
In terms of the Section 19s, are you having good dialogue with the land councils? Is that?
We've had some, yes, and I know that there are some operators who are taking those next steps to get onto the land using their Section 19s. I think the most critical issue is going to be around the labour force, and because quite a number of contractors do use local labour in communities when they're running operations, and whether that's actually going to be feasible or appropriate.
Thanks, Lloyd. And Ashley, from your industry's point of view, what's been the biggest challenge to date, and what do you see as the challenge in the immediate future?
So at the moment in our industry, the actual border closures occurred right at the time of first round mustard starting to ramp up, which became a bit of an issue for us. Notwithstanding that, our producers are already still going through very dry drought conditions, particularly in Central Australia, and then further north of that, and they had some rain. But in March, when those borders shut, we got through the process of the paperwork and navigating and getting livestock across, but more importantly, crews in, relatively simply and easily. And we're able to, as through the essential worker, essential service listing that came with border closures, we were able to actually manage the quarantine period really well and get the exemptions we needed. The biggest hurdle we've had is the moving that has occurred as a consequence of the changing environment of COVID. And as we all appreciated in this room, it was changing on a daily basis, sometimes on an hourly basis in terms of what was available. And that's where we've seen our struggles. And so what we've seen is delays in being able to get people out on site, or being able to having to go into quarantine in the first place. And so there's a loss of productivity there. To give you an example, we've got some exemptions, and some of the crews are able to actually quarantine on the station themselves, which is all well and good, but they're basically there for 14 days and can't do anything, can't interact with the crews, can't work. We've now got the other situation where if they want to come in for a week or 4 days, they're actually going to have to quarantine for 14 days before they can do that 1 week's worth of work. There's a lot of contractors, just the same as there is in Louise's industry within the buffalo, that we use. And primarily what you are seeing is delays in the context of the way the industry operates and functions as it would normally. Far more planning required, far more paperwork required, just to get stock, cattle and people to across the border and then back again.
So that's probably going to continue for a period of time, I would have thought.
That's not going to stop in the near future, and that's one of the challenges I think for all of us is, and the frustrating, the challenge for us is we don't know when that end game will be, and of course we've got to take on the advice of that. What we're not seeing though is if we are getting that clear space, clear air of no new cases, no new changes, we're exceeding that 28-day period, while we can't see some of the things that start to relax a little bit. Like from the NTCA's point of view, it would be great if we could get people into the Northern Territory under the exemption and not have to do that quarantine, because they're going to be in an isolated spot anyway, which is out on the cattle station. Won't work in all of the sector within our jobs, but certainly within that primary sector that you're going out on station. And that's been some of the largest impacts from us.
So early on you had issues with station orders through supermarkets. I mean, is that all been resolved now?
Yeah, so we've been collateral damage in a couple of ways, as has a lot of the agricultural sector, is when they rationing get put in by the two major supermarkets, Coles and Woolworths, and at the push of a button in Sydney and Melbourne, it affected the ability to order here locally in the Northern Territory, and they stopped taking bush orders. And then on top of that, they then rationed what could actually be bought. So that was another problem, because many of the stations were just starting to ramp up from a staff point of view. So suddenly they were dealing with more than 10 on average on the station at any one time, that could only get enough rations for 2 people. It was craziness. So that took about 3 or 4 weeks to resolve. And I've got to say to you, there was intervention at a number of levels, both at state and federal and national cabinet level. And to the credit of Coles and specifically Woolworths, they did a number of workarounds which initially weren't helpful, and then by Easter we started to see some of it back off, and they basically lifted the restrictions. The real issue then came in terms of could we get enough stock to the stores in the regions to actually satisfy demand. So a lot of that has been sorted, which is a positive, but it really exposed a supply chain problem moving forward, that whatever review occurs of this whole COVID-19, that's going to have to play a fundamental part, because that's a supply chain issue. And for our part, we believe it runs into a national security issue.
And you also had the problem early on around education as well, getting kids off stations that, you know.
It was kind of an inherited one, that one. But yes, we did. We did in that we got very close in South Australia in particular to solving that problem. where the students were flying back, and of course, kids go to school in the bush through the school of the air till year 6, and then they've got to go into a middle school environment, which means that most of them end up going into a boarding school arrangement, generally not in the Northern Territory. They'll go into state, whether that's Queensland, whether that's South Australia. And it's not just one or two either, Paul. When we started to look into it, there was more than 1,500, nearly 2,000 students that were going to be affected. Not just pastoralist kids, but also Indigenous kids from communities. In South Australia, they wanted to quarantine the kids for 2 weeks, but some of the boarding schools were saying you can't do that here, which means that they had to be quarantined off-site for 2 weeks. That had all sorts of complications. We almost got that solved in South Australia. However, in Queensland now, once those schools go back to school, which I think is next week or the week after, the Queensland government has said, if you are an interstate border, you come in, you don't need to isolate for 14 days. So we're seeing that restriction lifting slightly there. That's a positive.
Fantastic. And Will, the live export industry, we've all seen boats chugging out of the harbour, and you don't have to drive too far out of town to see plenty of trucks on the road. What's been the biggest issues facing you guys, and how have you dealt with it?
I think domestically we've been quite fortunate in that we've been able to adapt to changes in regulation quite quickly. There was certainly a period where we had to catch up with where the day-to-day changes were coming in, and that was quite challenging, but we managed to get exporters operational in every state of Australia. They're largely able to move across domestic borders quite easily without having quarantine. So I think we've been successful on that front, but really the challenge for us, excuse me, has been around market uncertainty. Trying to understand what the nature of the outbreak has been in Indonesia, trying to understand what decisions are being made there, how that will affect demand in the market. Very similar in Vietnam. With restaurants and bars being closed, that's a large part of our market, large part of the beef industry market internationally. So it's also had a big effect on us in terms of demand. We started the year very strong prior to the COVID outbreak, and I think we did see a drop off in the first couple of weeks of COVID. We ended up in Darwin being having a reasonably quiet April, but I think we'll see that strength. We've had a good month so far up here. We've sent 100,000 cattle so far this year out of Darwin overseas, and Indonesia's taken about 150,000 so far this year from ports across the country. So I think at the moment we're sitting quite well. The challenge is really just trying to understand what is happening in Southeast Asia, specifically what's happening in Indonesia, and trying to get numbers out of them that seem to make sense.
And have the COVID regulations or policies been consistent across all of the states and jurisdictions? Because I remember early on a Towns report came out with some statements around quarantining that just weren't going to be workable. Has that all been resolved? Is that?
Yeah, so, and I think that was, again, that's that early period. The states, I think in the first week, the states were sort of being led from the national level, and there seemed to be some good consistency. And then very quickly after that, we saw a divergence between how they decided to manage, specifically how they decided to manage ports. Maritime Safety Queensland implemented a very cautious policy during the beginning of the outbreak of enforcing 14-day restrictions for vessels entering port. So for us, practically speaking, what that means is 10 days back to the towns will see go. The vessel was essentially on charter, sitting out in front of the town for 4 days, which is very expensive and very challenging. So what we were able to do is we received exemptions from Maritime Safety Queensland. I think it was that period where we had to catch up. We needed to provide them with evidence that we could manage this risk, and the ports have been very good. Darwin port's been fantastic, in particular, in implementing processes on wearing. The sea port's been very good in implementing processes as well, and the shipping companies really took a lead in saying, well, this is how we can manage engagement when we are overseas. And so we've managed to minimise any sort of engagement with international ports and make sure that the risk really is controllable. And I think once we were able to evidence that domestically, we saw a better understanding of what was actually happening and how we can keep the trade moving.
You've got a pretty specialised workforce too, with nets and stockmen that So how have you managed that? I mean, is there enough of them, or has it been difficult to get them around? Because I know they arrive in Townsville and might be on a boat the next day in Darwin. Like, how does that work?
No, initially that was a really serious problem. So what we were able to do, all the stock that we were on, livestock vessels departing Australia are accredited by the industry. And that's something that the Department of Agriculture requires of us. So it was challenging in the beginning because we don't have a big pool of those guys. We sort of have.
I just want to speak up a bit.
Sorry, I'll come down to speak.
That's
So,
it's only twice I'm moving.
yeah, no.
These cattle guys are pretty close.
Yeah, we'll be okay. So it was certainly a challenge in the beginning. I think we needed the Federal Department of Agriculture was very helpful, and they were able to provide us with an online accreditation process. So we were able to take stockmen who'd previously been on vessels but may not have had current accreditation, or take people with significant experience in the industry and do an online accreditation for them and get a larger pool of stockmen available for the industry. So that was really something that happened very quickly. And to the credit of the Federal Department of Agriculture, they were very helpful in doing that. And the Industry Research and Development Corporation, Livecorp, who administers the accreditation, were able to set that up very, very promptly. And so we pulled a few guys out of retirement, and they're on vessels now. And we've managed to make it work. So it's been positive.
So we'll just stay with you for a moment. What do you see the challenges to your industry over the next 6 months in terms of, you've resolved most of your movement of people and you've got pretty good systems through the ports now. What are the challenges for you to actually reach your potential over and keep the economy ticking over?
Well, I think there's two areas where I think there's a lot of attention being focused on for us. So one of those challenges is about not being able to access our Southeast Asian markets in person. It brings with it some issues around auditing accredited facilities and making sure that our supply chains remain compliant with the SCAF system. So we've been working very closely with the Federal Department of Agriculture again on how we can still do audits, how we can still make sure that everything's compliant and operating the way it's meant to do. It's working at the moment, so we've managed to do online audits and online accreditations, and those things have been very positive. But that's certainly an area that will become more difficult over time. That's something that we need to be focusing on and trying to understand how we can get back into these markets. And if we can't get back into them, what is the next best thing? So I think that's an unknown at the moment in terms of how long are we not going to be able to access these markets. So we have compliance staff. Most of the exporters have compliance staff based in Indonesia and Vietnam, but I think there's a lot of staff over here who also go over for peak periods around Ramadan, around Eid, and they haven't been able to do that this year. So really focusing our attention on that and making sure that we can maintain the consistency that we've had in previous years around performance and supply chains is going to be a key area of focus for us. Domestically, I think Ashley mentioned it, and we'll talk about it in more depth. I mean, we're certainly looking at having supply shortages towards the end of the year. I think with all of this focus on COVID, there has been we probably need to start talking about the drought again, and we need to be talking about what we're doing to help producers and making sure that they're able to operate at their full potential.
It's probably a good opening for you, actually. So, like supply shortages, I think that's been a regular conversation over the years.
Yeah.
Is that real now?
Yeah. So just I want to touch on something that Will just touched on, where he talked about getting overseas and doing some of the certifications and face-to-face stuff. It's actually an issue for us back here too, because if you think about the Bachelor Abattoir, they're actually got to be certified Indonesian as well, and they actually can't do that until we can get the Indonesians over here to go through the abattoir to do that. So there's a reverse situation where domestically we've been affected by it. To go into the issue of supply though, we started 2020 potentially. We say we've got a herd of around 2.2 million. We work out, we think that herd is actually 25% less than what it was when you on top of sales due to the drought. So last year we moved an extraordinary number of cattle through the port of Darwin, about 400,000 through. On top of that, there was destocking occurred in Central Australia, and there was 600,000, which Louise has quoted a lot in terms of stock just moved off the barque. A lot of that stock hasn't come back. I was out there last week at Brunette Downs, and I think they have a carrying capacity around about 80,000. They were operating about 20. So we think our herd size is probably 25% down now. That's going to flow on in addition to the drought and what's happening with below average rainfall. Now, if you then combine, the challenge for us is they already create efficiency issues for the industry from getting to market, or getting stock to market around the price. And then you then add on to it the other challenges now associated with COVID-19, with having staff readily available, be able to move, to be able to go and respond to demand. I think that's probably our nearest and immediate challenge moving forward. Supply is going to be, there's plenty of stock to be available, and we will satisfy contracts, no question about it. But towards the end of the year, I think that second round mustard is probably going to be a lot smaller than it's been in previous years, and we probably won't be pushing as many cattle out towards the end of the year, around November, December, as we did last year. Because lots of numbers went across November, December last year.
Well, I was wondering if you thought that the Indonesian-Australia Free Trade Agreement that comes into effect from the 5th of July will have much of an impact for your export industry. Simon Birmingham had made the point last week that 99% of products moving into Indonesia will either be duty-free or significantly reduced in imposts. What does that mean for industry?
I think there are some positives in the trade agreement for the cattle industry. I think, for the export industry. One of them is certainly it's heartening to see the focus in the trade agreement on cattle. It's something that the Indonesians and the Australian government are obviously very keen on. There are some benefits in there in terms of tariff reductions for us, but I think we're not going to be hitting thresholds.
No, so, there's also some certainty on permit numbers, isn't there? So and that's been a moving piece previously.
And automating the process. So that's going to be helpful to us. But yeah, I think in terms of there's quantities in there that this year we really want to worry about. But it certainly is a positive.
And does that create an opportunity for you, Louise, with buffalo in terms of the live export of buffalo? If you can get access to that land out in Arnhem Land and where the buffalo live, does that create opportunity for a live export to top up some of those contracts? Is that?
Without a doubt, I think that's a really important second tier, and that's been identified previously. The other on Indonesia on land is what value add can buffalo be. So we've seen in Vietnam canned buffalo stew products and things like that selling well previously. That's what local enterprises do. We haven't pursued that sort of opportunity, but absolutely it's there waiting for the taking. And I think that's where hopefully the free trade agreement might bring some greater reciprocity in terms of business opportunities that Indonesia can see to feed other sections of the world, but that we facilitate.
I actually think, sorry Louise, there's actually I think an opportunity here in the industry, cattle industry, business here, but ahead of COVID, the Indonesian government wasn't able to guarantee its Indian buffalo supply chain in, and so it actually had a deficit of around about 170,000 tonnes of boxed buffalo meat. Now that's our largest single pain for us in the Indonesian marketplace because it is substantially cheaper.
Yes.
But that may open the door for a Northern Territory buffalo industry through the abattoir at Bachelor from a processing point of view that may not necessarily be live, but may in fact be boxed. So you might actually get 2 bites of an opportunity there through ICPA.
Yes.
That opens that door.
Yeah, hence the importance of the discussion and what you brought up yesterday in terms of the electricity prices at Bachelor, etc.
And the processing.
Yeah. I mean, the important thing for the buffalo producers is that there's a price where it's not viable to put it through the abattoir. However, we know how important having a fully functional multi-species abattoir is to the Northern Territory.
Yeah.
Critical. Yeah.
So I might flick back to you, Will. So what sort of diversification and innovation and things, different ways of doing business have you guys been doing? I mean, I know we've gone to weekly board meetings, monthly board meetings and weekly executive meetings at NT Farmers, so we're getting the input from our guys via Zoom, and that had some challenges early on, but we've managed to get through those. What sort of things have you had to do to get through and talk to your customers, because they're all over the world, and I would imagine they have similar internet issues that we may have in certain places?
I think we're lucky that we had a number of avenues to communicate with them prior to COVID. So I mean, one of the ones that's very common is things like WhatsApp and online platforms. So we had a lot of those embedded in the industry. So I think for us, there hasn't been a big change in communications other than really we're not in market as much as we normally would be. I think there's a large percentage of exporters at the moment with some pretty itchy feet. I think this is the longest they've ever been in Darwin. So I think that's probably a challenge. But in terms of the way the industry has had to change in communications, I don't think it's really shifted too much. It's pretty consistent from an industry sector or an association perspective. I've become much more acquainted with Zoom and a variety of other communications devices, which I'm not sure that I'm looking forward to continuing to use for too long. But I think really for us, it hasn't had to change too much.
So what I'm hearing is there's a lot of wives and partners that are pretty keen to push that around the
I'm not going to be quoted on that one.
National duty free.
No.
Look, from our industry's point of view, Paul, and look, I've done six sort of webinar, Zooms or Microsoft platforms just in the last 2 days, two and a bit days, and where 60 and 70 people have been on them. Some of them smaller than that. From our industry's point of view, we have comms issues out there anyway. I think moving forward, I think this is a platform that we may use a lot more, particularly when it's demystifying either new regulation, government regulation, or putting them in front of government people sooner. I think that's probably, now people have become more familiar with it and more relaxed with it. That's positive. But in terms of innovation and technology, there's already been a reasonable stream anyway. FarmBot, many would be knowledgeable of FarmBot, which they use for the remote ordering anyway and monitoring. So that was already out there and being used. I guess it's the human-to-human interaction. There are some things in our industry that technology and innovation won't replace, particularly when they're out in the ground and seeing themselves, the actual landscape, particularly around administrative process around land clearing. That's something that you won't be able to get around via a satellite image or a television camera, and you're going to have to be able to go around and see for yourself. So there are aspects where I think it will bring people together, but also, I talked about School of the Air before. That's been a fundamental for as long as people have worked on cattle stations in terms of radio or whether or not it's the internet. So I guess it's the frequency of use rather than the adaptation of use that we've seen increase too.
I reckon there'd be a fair few kids on stations teaching Dad how to use the Zoom and the internet. There'd be some arguments about that, I would have thought.
Well, I'm actually going to be interested at the end, but I might add into a survey on which platform they actually like, because without wanting to, we're on Zoom at the moment, but I've used a fair bit of the Microsoft Teams platform, which I found very good, and others use Skype. I mean, it's realistically, I'd be interested to know what people's experience has. And NBN and the other telecommunications providers actively increased the bandwidth, so people have benefited from that.
And we've certainly found that with some of our more remote guys too, that we had when we went through a risk analysis really early on and said these are our real risk areas. One of them was the internet, and whether we were going to have enough capacity.
Yeah.
But I think it's held up really well. We haven't had the issues. If we were having this conversation 5 years ago, we wouldn't be talking like this.
Well, we would, but in slow, choppy sentences.
So I think that NBN, that whole rollout of technology has improved so much that there might be some applications that a couple of years ago probably weren't a realistic option, but they're there and present now. So.
Well, it's the tyranny of distance, sorry, Louise. It's the tyranny of distance. I mean, talking about cattle stations that are 2,500 square kilometres as average size. And so it's a long way when you're from the homestead to that water bore, and being able to actually monitor it and manage it from the homestead can be a problem.
One thing I wanted to say though was that the Northern Territory came out very strong and had quality documents around COVID-19, but what we saw was Queensland and then WA go digital due to the WA border, whereas we didn't. That was reflected in then the processing you said about the federal government, and I know that it's something that the different agencies in the Northern Territory have. Some have got very good IT systems and some don't, and it probably is something that the Northern Territory government needs to address, or to look at piggybacking on other jurisdictions going forward, because to be able to have something online and just processed immediately, we wouldn't have seen some trucks turn back because they didn't have the right paperwork in the truck. They did have it when they started their journey. 2 days later, there's a change of paper, and then they're being denied access at an internal biosecurity checkpoint, which just added to the stressors. Businesses were trying to be very efficient in their doing business, and there was a few of those examples. We've all got them, which perhaps didn't need to be there, but hopefully the interim review that we've all talked to government about happens soon, so that we've all got those examples still at our fingertips, and we're not reviewing the whole process in 6 months' time and fail to capture some of those things. They do the post-cyclone reviews pretty well in the Northern Territory, and I think we all, from industry and government, need to call for that interim review to be completed thoroughly sooner, in case there is a second wave or a third wave, or whatever may be coming with a new pandemic in the future, that we can implement and
So that's a really interesting statement, Louise. In terms of the hospitality industry that kicked back off last Friday, and I did go to the pub and have a beer. I was one of the first people there through the door, but they went to a tick and flick online self-assessment tool straight away. Is that something that you think would benefit us now? They've obviously got the software, and they've obviously got.
I think we've almost earned it.
Yeah.
Sorry, Paul. We were the guinea pigs early. I think we've earned it.
Yeah.
So I think we need to go down that path.
That's my thought as well.
The restrictions are easing up. We need to see some of the gains in the hard yards.
Yeah, and certainly I'm sure that there are divisions of the Northern Territory government that have got the platforms that can do that, then on behalf of other agencies. Trade, Business and Innovation might be it. My concern though is that there's, for example, that infectious training package that's been looked at. From a road transport industry point of view, it is gimmicky. It is not what our industry has already implemented. I mean, they've had to be really conscientious about how they manage a person becoming infected, away from home or in the truck and at a distance from any health facility. How you get someone who's showing signs to to a facility. So the COVID management plans are very comprehensive, health and hygiene wise, etc. We don't want a tick and flick that is perhaps fine for a hospitality worker, someone going into a pub, but is not sufficient for someone who's going into a range of depots or into and into agricultural properties or biosecurity zones, etc. We cannot afford that to be diminished and then have an industry closed down.
As a consequence.
Yeah, we've seen that with the aged care facilities around Australia. So I think a one-size-fits-all infectious disease control training is probably not what our industry, from a road transport perspective, would like to see. We want something that is as sophisticated as we've been applying and consistently rolled out.
I think early on, involved. So I think the emergency operations center was brilliant in the beginning, and I think they really had they had it under control. Somewhere along the way, we split away from being really outcomes focused, and it was more important what was written in the document than the practices we were actually following. So our the NTLEA COVID management plan in the beginning was 4 pages. It only covered domestic movements, and at the time that was the environment we were under. Now, export, obviously, with having guys coming back from being on vessels, was considered high risk. And our plan was extended out to 10 pages, and then it was extended out to 12 pages, and then we had to rewrite sections of it. And I think that was all positive, and it was all fine. We understood that we were high risk and we needed to manage these things, but the process got bogged down because of what was written down on paper rather than really focusing on what was actually happening. Yeah. And I think what I was really heartened to see, and again, this goes back to the shipping companies, the stevedores, the ports, and the exporters. The practices that they actually followed were brilliant and were incredibly thorough, and they were really trying to manage risk as much as possible. I don't think there's any sector in Australia as nervous about potentially bringing COVID-19 back to Australia as the live export industry. That's really not the media story. We were hoping they'd pull out of this process, so we were very much on top of it. No, we didn't. But no, we were really focused on practice, and I think some of especially the later stages, COVID management plans, I think we lost focus a little bit on really what we were trying to achieve, and became a little bit more about what was written in the document, and that's where I think we suffered issues.
And I think you're so right, Will. The concern that I had was that it became more bureaucratic, and what happened in the very early stages, throughout end of March and till after Easter, it was very much industry and government working together, and a lot of communication and a lot of willingness to cooperate around resolving things. And then we saw government agencies picking up staff from different departments, tourism, etc., going into work on these COVID plans who don't know our industry backgrounds, and then it became bogged down, as you say. And one of the strong points that I'll be taking back to that interim review, and I hope it is sooner, is industries carrying the greatest risk, and no one wanted to be that front page headline, and we have that front and centre in every action that we take. Also going forward, we don't want to be an aged care facility, which will really damage our industry considerably. So but it cannot become a bureaucratic process. It has to still be how every individual is refreshed and reminded. There's a cultural shift around responsibility taking, and that's not driven by regulation or a big stick.
No. On one of the points you made about when West Australia went online, moved all their forms online, and how we got exposed that we didn't have that ability. I think that's a very good point, in that just on our normal regulatory approaches, like registration is one area that isn't fully developed online, that should be fully developed online post-COVID-19, because that is a real problem. When the shutdown designated areas, police were not doing it, no one was doing vehicle registrations, and you had cattle properties with $80,000 in registrations to complete. They couldn't actually complete them, and they couldn't complete them online either. And so they're in this no-win situation. So if anything comes out of it, the interim review might be the place where it comes up, is how the Northern Territory Government functions, in inverted commas, and particularly in that online space, to actually, so that in a case like this, the actual wheels of government keep turning, because there is actually a back end, or there is an electronic way to do things. We don't do it enough.
No, they're well aware of it. It's just the price tag that comes with revamping IT systems, but if you don't bite the bullet, then
you've got to do it at some point.
Everyone pays the price. Yes.
And I never saw that.
And I think government's proven that they can move fast if they have to. That's the one learning that I've taken out of all of this.
It was really positive, wasn't it?
Yeah.
They did respond magnificently early on. let's be honest.
And across multiple levels of government.
Yeah.
I've never seen that before. Like, I've been involved with pieces of legislation that have taken 3, 4, 5, 6 years to get anywhere. I've seen things happen quicker now. So let's make this the new normal. We talk about the new normal. Well, this needs to be the new normal, and we need to be keeping the governments and the bureaucrats to account, because this is what we want to see moving forward, is a more nimble and more reactive government from our point of view. I guess I just want to throw a couple of other questions, because I know we're getting up towards our time. So the next 3 to 6 months, and I just want to put it through a lens of what Anastasia Palaszczuk said this morning, that it's potentially September before the restrictions come off in Queensland. WA have said similar. We're still a little unsure on what's happening in the NT, and we don't particularly have a clear direction. What's that mean for your industry, and where are we going to be in 3 to 6 months if we're still in this limbo of lockdown and not sure whether we're going to reopen?
I think for our industry, it's going to compound the dry weather conditions. So we're going to be battling the drought conditions which already exist, and then on top of that, it's going to be a layer of administration, bureaucracy with restrictions. Maybe not within our borders, but certainly transporting in and out, and also getting staff in and out. That is going to substantially impact on the cost of doing business, which in drought conditions with destock with limited cash flow is going to have problems moving forward. Now, there are available to them through the RIC loans and those sorts of things, and we'll make a comment about re-putting drought up the top there in terms of focus again. I think with the restrictions, we actually compound that, and I think that's where the negatives for our industry will come in the first instance. And in the second instance, the negatives for us will come in the context of employment. And that is that if there are 13,000 Territorians who do not get their jobs back, and one of their partners is connected to our industry or industries, then the chances are that even though they may have a job in the cattle industry and there are 10,000 directly and indirectly employed, then, and the other partner hasn't been able to secure a job, it doesn't matter what that is, neither of them will stay. They will both go to a different constituency in another state to get a job. So I think that is the second round part of where we are exposed moving forward.
Which sort of leads me into the next question. Like, I might start with you, Ashley, and then I'll go to Louise. But how well do you think the Territory's placed to rebound and, kickstart the economy? I mean, we are in a lucky situation where we have a large agricultural resources sector which has
kept ticking over,
kept going,
and kept trading and kept internationally exporting.
Yeah.
How well can we look? Do you know what it really comes down to what happens at the end? Everyone's exhausted at the end of the 12 weeks. I know that public service will be. I know we are. So we then now can't stop. We've actually now got to get a little bit deeper into the trench and start digging a bit harder. We certainly have all the makings of opportunity to rebound really, really strongly. The question is time is against us. If time is against us, then there's got to be urgency. If there's urgency, it means administrative, it means all these things that we saw. You talked about the new normal of government and what they can do in a very quick period of time. All of that has to be replicated, but from the investment. I think that's the key to unlocking us over the next 12 months. And just everything's got to be on the table from the point of view of what can be done and what can be done quickly, and then filtering that out and getting on with it. But I think we can respond, but it's how quickly we can respond to urgency drives.
What about you, Louise?
Yeah. I think the Northern Territory economy is extremely interdependent, so every industry is interdependent and intertwined. We're very aware that tourism may not kickstart again before next dry season, and someone described it as having like 3 wet seasons in a row. So we've had a wet season, this is a wet season, and then we'll have another wet season. So tourism doesn't kick off. The airlines are going to be struggling at all coming back, which impacts on the cost of anyone trying to travel into the Territory for work, whether it's with mining or agricultural or road transport. We're very aware that there's only 6 weeks after the end of the financial year, the Northern Territory will be going to an election. We've got a very significant dependency on what the federal government chooses to fund and not fund in the Northern Territory. That's a given. We've got 250,000 people, 1/6 of the Australian continent. Will always have that dependency for our economic supports. So how do we keep everyone focused on the lobbying efforts and the monies coming out of Canberra and continuing to flow out the pipeline of infrastructure projects which have been talked about? We've all contributed to the national agenda as well as the Northern Territory agenda, when in normal circumstances, pre-election, everything slows down for often a period of months. In this particular circumstance, we cannot afford, and certainly industry cannot afford, for that slowdown to occur. We've all got to be pushing. It's a dry season. We particularly are influenced because we've got 30% of our road network is sealed, 70% of it is unsealed in the Territory, which has a huge impost on how we get product to market. So this is a unique set of circumstances, and so we can't afford it to be politics as normal. We cannot afford that.
So interesting. I like that analogy around 3 wet seasons in a row. I don't think there's any agricultural person that would not
would like that all 3 wet seasons in a row.
Which probably just it's a comment more than anything. Is there a really big risk that we go into a territory election in August and we go into caretaker mode right when
we need it most?
Yeah. What's the thought process? How are we going to get decisions? National Cabinet's still going to be meeting. Like, has anyone got any thoughts on how that's all going to work? I mean, we're only 100 days or 98 days away to an election. We go into caretaker mode 6 weeks out. Where are the decisions going to come from?
It's a really good question.
Yeah, not sure. And of course, everything will be seen through a political prism and not through necessarily the best policy prism.
That's right.
And there's a little bit of I had a bit of a discussion about that this morning actually with a member of the media, which was the Chief Minister has said that people don't like the fact they have open borders and they don't have to vote for me. And not necessarily sure it should be a political issue was the point of the media person. I kind of tend to agree. It's got to be done because it has to be done for the right reasons, not because it's a political decision. But the bold statement of don't vote for me if you don't want it, if you don't unhappy about it, then I don't think works. I think it's got to be something different to that. I think the timing couldn't be worse of an election because it just adds to a level of instability which we don't need. We need certainty, and we need certainty of governance. And so that may affect the thinking of people going to the polls, and if it does, that's good in terms of they know then that we've got certainty. But there'll be a period of 4 weeks where there is a total uncertainty. No one is going to know what's going to happen next, and that's not healthy.
Yes, so we do need to be having conversations in that space to see what in this unique environment an alternative arrangement might be during the caretaker mode. I wrote down, and I've forgotten who actually said it, but the decisions we make today will shape our country generations. There is a lot of evidence from the World Health Organization that this pandemic won't be the last we see. It won't be 100 years like the Spanish flu before we have another emerging infectious disease that we don't have a vaccination for. And so the decisions we make today will shape the country for generations is something we all need to absorb and sincerely understand the impact of that. And so again, we can ill afford to play politics at a time when the economy is hugely impacted. We've got growing unemployment in Australia. The Northern Territory may come off less scathed by that than other jurisdictions who have higher population numbers, but we still, as a collaborative group, need to think in a very unified way, because if we divide, we get nothing. You know, there was a comment this morning that there's still $3 billion sitting in that North Australian Infrastructure Fund. We have a new Minister for Northern Australia, Keith Pitt, and he needs to be very outspoken in lobbying for how we can best utilise that $3 billion infrastructure fund that's sitting there. You know, there are a lot of projects that are probably well and truly suited to Northern Territory, WA and Queensland. I know a couple have come out of Queensland recently, but we do need you know, to really push those opportunities if we're going to get less elsewhere.
So from your industry, Will, like what are the top line things, whether they be regulatory or investment, that's going to give your industry a real boost, well, here you go. Is there a magic bullet for your industry moving forward that?
No, so I think in the context of the next 3 to 6 months, there is, we have some fairly significant regulatory challenges coming in November, where the new standards for the Australian standards for the export of livestock are going to be coming into effect. So I think one of the big things, I mean, from a territory perspective, we need to make sure that, especially in government, there's a real understanding of how that's going to affect supply chains. And where possible, there is a priority around making sure that we're supporting the industry as much as possible, because it will have a very direct impact on us, and it comes at a bad time. Now, we need to implement these standards. We've had them written for a while. I understand the impetus around having them brought in, but making sure that it's done in a way that doesn't, I guess, hit the industry with a sledgehammer overnight, and that it is done in a way that's equitable. It's made sure that everyone is on the same page. Going back to what you're talking about with stakeholder, I'm sorry about the caretaker period. I don't want to focus on it too much, but I think there are things that we can focus on at the moment. There are problems that we've had from a territory perspective, from a federal perspective, for the territory for a long time. And I don't think we necessarily need a lot of creative thinking to try and solve them. I think going in, I mean, one of the big ones for us, and one of the big ones I think for everybody at the table, is around workforce development. There needs to be a focus on making sure that we have guys, staff who are available, who are appropriately skilled, making sure they're not leaving the territory. You know, these sorts of things are going to be very important, and they're not political issues. I understand there are political challenges in amongst some of the problems we have with agricultural territory, but if we can take away the things and say, look, these are the things that we can focus on for this period, and really prioritise them and make sure that when we are in caretaker, we've still got things going out, that we've still got progress being made on trying to support our industry. I think that's really where there is an opportunity, and I think there needs to be an agricultural focus at the moment. We are a pillar of the territory. We have always been a pillar of the territory. We will always be a pillar of the territory. Let's focus on it.
And from your point of view, Ashley, is there something that could really give your industry a boost? And some of this doesn't cost money. I mean, for us, it's if we can streamline those environmental approvals and water licensing and make that a couple of months process, not a couple of year process, we've got investment ready to go.
Yeah, and we would agree. I think part of the key that we have moving forward is if there's anywhere where we can attack the low-hanging fruit, it's actually the approvals process and accelerating the approvals. People often say, oh, we're going to cut red tape. No, it's actually about accelerating the approvals process, making it quicker, streamlining it, and getting it across the line quicker. And I just had a meeting this morning on that very issue about what can be run in conjunction and then how quick. And you know, some things will still take 6 months, which is still a hell of a long time to actually get across the line, when it probably didn't 3 years ago. But the scrutiny is different to 3 years ago.
So, and I think similar. There's a similar theme there about streamlining things, like we were able to do during the COVID period. One of the issues during the COVID period, and one of the issues that we've had previously, is around certainty. And I think that's something that we really need to focus on. We need to start providing absolute line paid guarantees. And that's a real issue. I mean, for us, personally, it's a real challenge that we have. There is a misallocation at times or a variation in the application of rules. So I think going back to those things, again, it doesn't cost money. It's just about whether it's internal training, whether it's about internal reviews, and really understanding these things. But providing certainty during this period to the industry, to individuals, I think is really important.
To me, the ideal position for the government and the public service, right, moving forward in the next 6 months, particularly around approvals, is for them to be able to say, it's not us. In other words, private sector with your investment, it's you. We've actually given you the approvals. We've done all the work. There's no other obstacles now. It is now up to you and your final investment decision and you sourcing the investment dollars to actually, because all the approvals are in place. And if you look at something like Project Sea Dragon, where all the approvals are in place, it's now just about the money and sourcing the money to actually get the project to go ahead. If I was the government and the public service, that's the optimum position for me to be. I've done everything at my end. Over to you, private sector, because at the end of the day, it's the private sector that's going to drive the jobs and create the investment. It's not going to be the government.
I just wanted to reiterate your point around supply chains. So that CRC for Northern Australia project, looking at the reframing smart supply chains, is very important. But it's important to the extent that it will highlight where our deficiencies are, and then what could actually really give greater bang for their buck to producers, better freight rates, etc. We've emphasised how important road infrastructure is. Getting the Mango Road money spent, getting the Central Arnhem Road money and the federal government money rolling out as quickly as possible. The spend on the Tanami Road, the Plenty Highway moving. We've urged, and Infrastructure Australia heard that around road maintenance. Road maintenance is as critical as putting new bitumen on roads as well for new allocations. If we don't do that, then we will have real problems. So, not getting distracted by the COVID crisis, etc. We still need to do well all the things that we know are problems, and fixing the supply chain for Northern Territory business is massive. Everyone wins if that's the case.
Does anyone got anything else they want to add?
No, but by the looks of it, there's at least one question up there I can see. But no, I think.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was a point you made.
Yeah, I spoke about that on the radio the other day. It's a very good point. It's the first time I've ever in my whole life seen levels of government actually working together in a bipartisan approach. I mean, it's starting to fall apart now, but so I'd just like to thank Will Evans, Ashley Manicaros, Louise Bilato. Next week we've got Minister Paul Kirby, Department of Primary Industry and Resources on. So please tune in again next week. I just want to say to everyone, thanks very much for tuning in. We have taken ourselves online a lot more now as an organisation. Normally we'd be out in the paddock kicking dirt and having this conversation. But please stay engaged, look after your friends, look after your neighbours. It's going to be a difficult time for everyone. Keep washing your hands and let's keep the economy moving. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.